Hello, and welcome to lesson 6 of the Goal of Full Employment, where we're doing Unit 3, AOS2, our government's domestic macroeconomic goals. We just looked at what the goal of full employment was last lesson in terms of what the definition was and some of the classifications of unemployment. So employed, unemployed, underemployed, hidden unemployed, long-term unemployment, and frictional unemployment, and what the meanings of all of those were. Today we're going to be looking at more about calculating various labour force indicators. So calculating the labour force participation rate, calculating the unemployment rate, calculating the underutilization rate. All of these are going to be really important for your end of year exam and any SACs that you have, as often multiple choice questions require you to use data to calculate some of these indicators. So our key knowledge for today is the measurement of the labour force, including the participation rate, the unemployment rate, and labour force underutilization rate, which we're going to look at how to do each of them, and the difference between cyclical and structural unemployment. One of the key things, and one thing that ends up being quite helpful throughout academics through the year, whenever you see the word cyclical, that usually refers to fluctuations in aggregate demand, and structural usually is all about long-term aggregate supply-based issues. So learning intention has been all along is to understand the impact of changing economic activity on the domestic macroeconomic goals, as we're talking about again, specifically full employment in this current section of the topic. Our success criteria today is that you can calculate multiple labour force indicators and you can distinguish between cyclical and structural unemployment. So we've been saying the word labour force a lot, so it's really important to know what the labour force is. So labour force is considered all the employed and unemployed persons in an economy added together. So for example here, if an economy had 5 unemployed persons and 10 employed persons, the labour force would be 15 people. So that's really important. Labour force is all unemployed plus employed people. So in simple form, it is the unemployed plus employed is going to equal your labour force. And you don't need to do that a lot. And a lot of people get tripped up because they use population rather than the labour force. So then using the labour force, we can calculate a lot of different things. So first up here, we have the participation rate. So the participation rate is the labour force divided by the population over the age of 15 who are not actively studying. So we've got an example here which I've taken from the RBA, where the participation rate expresses the labour force as a percentage of the working age population. And so using the numbers in the example above, there are 13.3 million people in the labour force and the working age population is 20 million people. So if we were to work this out in terms of the math, what we've got here is we've got the labour force over the population, which ends up being 13.3 over 20 times 100, and that is 2/3 or 66.5%. What's going to be important here is in your exams, in your SACs, these numbers should be relatively simple. So it's pretty likely you're going to get things like the labour force might be 6 and the population might be 10. And then you're just going to have to be able to work out that it ends up being 60%. And so it's going to be really important there. But you should be able to do these numbers if you put them in the right spot. Then we've got the unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate is the number of unemployed persons divided by the labour force. So as we remember, the labour force is all employed and unemployed people. So in the example we've got here, if we have 12.6 million people employed and 0.7 million unemployed, we've got a labour force of 13.3 million. So in this case, that ends up being 0.7 over 13.3, which is equal to 5.3%. If we were to simplify this a little bit, we could have a population where there are 9 people employed, 1 person unemployed, which means we've got a labour force of 10. That is going to mean in that case that we've got 1 over 10 times 100, and that is going to be a 10% unemployment rate. So you just need to be able to work that out, being able to work out what the labour force is, and then work out the unemployment rate from that. Then our last measurement that we've got to do in terms of our overall math is the underutilization rate. So the underutilization rate is the number of unemployed plus underemployed persons divided by the labour force. Some students get confused and only do the underemployed, but what's really important here is that underemployed people are included as employed as far as the labour force is concerned. So if we want to find out how many people are not working or not being used to their full capacity, we've got to add them onto the unemployed persons and then divide that by the labour force and times it by 100. So if we had an example here, if there are 18 persons who were employed, 2 were unemployed and 1 was underemployed, what would the math be on that? So in this case, our labour force is still just the unemployed plus the employed, which is 18 plus 2, which is that 20 that we've got up here. To work out the underutilization rate, we've then got to take the unemployed, which is 2, and the underemployed, which is 1, and divide that by the labor force, which is 20. So that ends up being 3 over 20, which is equal to 15%. So that means in that economy, 15% of the people are either unemployed or not working to their full capacity. And they're the three main calculations that you'll ever have to do about unemployment and the labor force. So we get into the difference between cyclical and structural unemployment. So whenever you see the word cyclical in economics, it's always going to refer to anything that is caused by fluctuations in aggregate demand. And that is going to be really, really important. So that's like our business cycle, how things go up and down in those cyclical patterns. Cyclical unemployment is all about how unemployment changes when we go through those waves in economic activity. So as economic activity starts to rise, unemployment starts to fall as businesses employ more people to meet the increased demand for production. When economic activity starts to slow down, businesses start to lay off workers to protect their profit margins as production starts to fall or slow. So if aggregate demand is rising, for example, if discretionary incomes were increased, this sends a signal to businesses to increase total production. To increase production, businesses are then likely to require more labor, which increases the derived demand for labor and therefore decreases cyclical unemployment. If aggregate demand is falling, on the other hand, so for example, if interest rates were increased, this sends a signal to businesses to slow production to prevent overproduction. This means that they can reduce their need for labor and therefore lay off workers, which increases cyclical unemployment. And then when we look at structural unemployment, it's all about unemployment caused on the supply side from changing business conditions, which can be due to cost cutting, offshoring, business closures, replacing labor with technology. For example, Coles have made almost every checkout in their supermarkets to be self-served. This would have reduced their overall need for labor and therefore led to some structural unemployment. So because they only need 2 or 3 staff on for all of the customer service now, rather than having one person on every register, that's going to create some structural unemployment as their need for labor is a lot smaller overall. Other structural unemployment can be if businesses close due to not being profitable anymore. This happened a lot during COVID, as a lot of businesses could no longer compete in the changing business conditions, and therefore that will lead to significantly increased structural unemployment. And that's it for all these labor force calculations and the difference between structural and cyclical unemployment. As always, if you have any questions, leave a comment below or email me, sean@therunningeconomy.com. I'd love to hear any feedback that you have. And other than that, I hope you have a wonderful day and I will see you next time. Goodbye.